pronouns are he, preferred pronouns are he, him, and POI is lovely. Congrats to everyone for making it this far. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. For a war in Europe in 2022 to be occurring on a scale so large, it's comparable to both world wars, with casualties just in 1 month amounting to 1,081 civilians being killed, including children, and 1,707 being injured. We think it's within NATO's obligation and NATO's best interest to assassinate Vladimir Putin to put an end to this. What do we think that assassination would actually look like, and how would it materialize on proposition? So, in the assassination, pretty basic definitions, right? It would essentially be killing Vladimir Putin. And we think we want it to be sort of discreet, right? And what would this assassination look like on the world of 4G, right? We think we've got two means of this happening, right? Firstly, we have like two options on how we would kill Putin. Firstly, we use an external assassination, right? We think we'd have an assassin that NATO would send into Russia to eliminate him, right? Or second option, if that wasn't feasible, we think that we'd opt for a more internal assassination, right? So we think that this would be done by a medium-level member of like Putin's party or his military and so on. So this would either be them like poisoning Putin, or this would be them like physically assassinating Putin with a gun. We think that this would be feasible because firstly, Putin has been purging party members, right? At this week, and we've seen some of them going missing even. And secondly, because we think that corruption within the Russian military is so significant to the point where in which we think it'd be very easy for us to actually buy over a Russian officer. And we think that there's a strong incentive for these people to actually turn over because they themselves have been facing the repercussions of American sanctions, and they themselves have also been like victims of purging and victims of seeing their families being torn apart, right? So we think that there's a very strong political and emotional incentive for them to actually buy into NATO's like offer to actually assassinate Putin, right? And what is the burden on proposition and OG, right? I think the burden here is to prove to you that the assassination of Vladimir Putin will be feasible and will allow for reduced tension in Europe. And who do we think the stakeholders are going to be? Right? We think it's got to be NATO's best interest. And some pre-rebuttals to what I think that opposition might bring up. We think that opposition might bring up this whole like no violence like approach to this, right? Let's sanction them. I think that insofar as sanctions are being placed on Russia, we think it's targeting two main groups, right? One is the Russian citizens and the oligarchs. We think that the oligarchs are really much out of this debate because the oligarchs are able to sustain, right? Even though they're having that, their football clubs being taken from them. We think that Russian citizens are essentially the ones who are starving because they've been their resources are depleting and they are becoming more and more desperate. Even if opposition were to claim that, these sanctions would be enough to pressure the people on, overthrowing Putin and protesting, I think we've seen recently how easy Putin has squashed dissent within Russia by shutting down and even detaining journalists, right? Shutting down state media. And on economic pressure, we think that Putin and Russia as a whole has a crap ton of pre-existing oil and wheat money, which can be used to sustain Russia long enough to actually invade Ukraine. But we tell you that Ukraine and Europe does not have those resources to actually sustain themselves, nor do they have the resources to sustain a third world war. First argument on why assassinating Vladimir Putin would allow for means of de-escalation in the European region. Why is that true? We think in this debate, the actor's best interest is priority number one. So we think that NATO's best interest is who should be acting in, right? So we think that NATO's best interest is essentially Europe, right? What Europe wants and what Europe needs is NATO's best interest. Firstly, because they consist a large amount of NATO states, and also because NATO and Europe has a very good economic ties, and they are very they're friendly with one another. And why is that de-escalation is so important to begin with? Two reasons, right? Why we think that firstly, it's got to be the threat of a large-scale third world war, because recognize that states neighboring to Ukraine, like Poland, are pretty vulnerable to Russia, right? Because we think that this is true because Ukraine borders Poland, right? When we're seeing countries like Belarus being very gratuitous to Russia and very friendly with Russia, and Poland now is pretty damn vulnerable, right? Because you've got Russian troops in Belarus, and you've seen Russia invading Ukraine in that really bordering region of Poland. You even had some extremely close encounters, right? I mean, we can't risk a large-scale war, and assuming that Putin takes Ukraine, or he switches his sights towards Russia or more weaker NATO states, we think this will result in a large-scale war. Why is that true, right? Two reasons. Firstly, because of the NATO agreement, right? NATO countries essentially have agreed upon that if one of their NATO states were to be invaded, the response would be to essentially just retaliate, right? And even the US and all other NATO states have pledged to defend their country, and countries like Poland, which are pretty vulnerable to Russia right now. Assuming that what will happen, that would result in a third world war. And why do we think de-escalation is so important in status quo, right? We think that this firstly Firstly, it would be to avoid a third world war. We think that the casualties and the lives lost in Europe would be pretty significant, right? Because recognize that the Second World War, the First World War were more than enough to imply to you the effects of how a large-scale war like this would affect an entire region. We think that a third world war would result very likely in nuclear war, and that brings me to my second point on why there would be a threat of nuclear war. I think this is likely for a couple of reasons, right? Firstly, because Russia has made it very clear and has even threatened the global community that a result of interference, like NATO interference, would be having them engaging in nuclear war, right? They launch missiles. And if opposition tells you that, hey, that's an empty threat from Russia to scare off NATO, we think that Russian threats of Ukraine, of invading Ukraine, were also viewed as empty threats last year. So I think we can't really take that lightly. Second reason why it's probable, right? We think this is extremely probable because we've been seeing this increasing trend of like Putin acting like a madman, right? He's not being really that consistent with his actions, and he's been like going pretty mad. We think it's fair to say at this point, Putin is being pretty inconsistent, so we can't really be placing the lives of millions of people in Europe or in the hands of someone like Vladimir Putin, assuming that, hey, no, he's not going to invade, he's not going to launch. Why do we think assassination is the most feasible means of de-escalating tension? Why is that true? I think that Putin currently is pretty hell-bent on taking Ukraine, right, regardless of the cost. His own military is taking hits, and along with it, he's disabling the entire state of Ukraine to death, right? Because all he's out of option, and his last resort is to commit war crimes. Finally, how are we able to de-escalate the situation? Let's look at the aftermath of the situation, right? In that post-assassination, essentially the person coming into the power would be somebody like Putin who purged his entire cabinet, right? So this means that they will purge from cabinet and they are very much wealthy, influential, and more likely to cooperate with NATO in the future due to them forming an alliance for like mutual benefits. So will result in Russia not going on like entire rampages, right? But even if you took us at our worst, and if we were being charitable to opposition, if this person were to like backstab NATO and do something that goes against the agreement and alliance, I think that NATO has the political ammunition to sort of like, prevent this person from becoming a cooperative member. Right? This means that, for example, this person decides to go and invade Ukraine, I think that they're very likely to get, coerced by NATO, blackmailed by NATO, saying that they will leak this information, and likely they will use this political draw and influence that they once had in Russia. Right? We think that it's important, and we think that finally, even if they were to come up with sanctions as alternatives, like I already mentioned to you, that's just not going to work, right? Because Belarus and Putin have already stockpiled like $600 billion that will essentially serve to boost the ruble currency, right? And thus maintain the economics that Russia is so contingent on. Right? We tell you that Russia is sanction-proof because Putin's actions are implying that he no longer is acting in the best interest of Russia, but more so in the best interest of him, or essentially just trying to boost his ego, right? We're able, and what does proposition achieve, right? We're able to, what does OG achieve, right? We're able to de-escalate the situation. We're able to maintain it by having some means of like Russian-NATO relationships, and we think which results in a future where they're unable to have like conflicts. We think results in atrocities like this and war crimes like this from being avoided, right? Whereas we think on oppositions, well, it's Ukraine and other states in the future engaging in like a third world war, nuclear war, and a violation of human rights and persistent war crimes. I think for all those reasons, you should be siding with OG.
Thank you, PM, and apologies to Nick for not being able to see your message soon enough before I asked PM to start our speech. Would you still like to take a very short break? Oh, alright. Apologies for not seeing it soon enough. Okay, again, thank you, PM, for the speech. Now inviting the LO. I mean, the
Hi,
leader of
everyone.
opposition. Right.
Hi, everyone. I'm the LO. My preferred pronouns are she or her, and I'd like to take POIs verbally. I'll begin my speech in
Wait, sorry. I'm just seeing message. It appears that there's a speaker from op. I'm not sure if O or CO that wasn't able to hear the speech during the last minute. I think this already reported a little bit late than what I think normally it's supposed to be. Perhaps I can consult AJCOR or GOM regarding the matter.
Hi, I'm the leader of opposition. I'll be speaking in a few seconds. My preferred pronouns are she or her, and I'd like my POIs verbal, please. I'll be speaking in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the problem with PROP is that they misconstrue the power that Putin holds. If and when the assassination fails, it's very likely tensions will spiral out of control. We push China towards Russia. It's also very unlikely that NATO will even comply to this, because it's clear that sanctions are the only solution so proud to oppose. What do we all want? We want Russia to stop their advances. The debate is then, which way is more effective, murder or sanctions? PROP tells you without justification that killing Putin is okay because he's gone on a crazy rampage. We think this is very unsubstantive. They also said that it will decrease tensions and de-escalation is the only way to solve this issue. They also don't tell you how they achieve that on their side. We think our comparative is much better. Our mechanism looks like this. We improve and increase the amount of economic sanctions imposed in large chunks towards Russia's economy. Instead of the status quo of gradual escalated ones, we provide we don't allow offending countries to have enough time to work out. We allow a more effective way of sort of de-escalating the situation, but also impacting the powerful oligarchs that have essentially supported Putin's entire regime. That's our counterfactual, the current increase of sanctions. Then let's start with the setup and how our framework improves, how our framework is largely better comparative to PROPs. So we have to characterize the situation of the war. Two things. One, let's look at Putin's popularity in Russia. Three responses. We think because his popularity is low, he's using this national violence to increase patriotism within Russia and to direct the citizens' attention away from the issues at home, such as poverty and starvation, for example. That's why when Crimea happened, Putin became popular again. That is why when we attack him and attempt to assassinate him, he becomes glorified within his own country, especially because the Russian propaganda and media, is very vague on the situation right now. The media in Russia is calling this a special military operation and not an unprovoked attack that it is. Therefore, we prove to you it's very likely Putin will be victimized and he will use this to do two things. One, become more popular. Two, that is how he will increase the attacks. He will use this as justification to attack more countries outside of Ukraine. Lastly, we think that this is not going to be successful anyway. We think Putin is already prepared. He's been hiding in bunkers for the past months. Then let's look at NATO's ideology and what NATO is likely to do regarding their own countries. We think two things. Number one, NATO's followers are largely rational decision makers. These are members within developed countries that do not want to see World War III happen. They're unlikely to assassinate Putin. Two, what jurisdiction does NATO have? NATO does not do assassinations anyway. We think this is not even possible then. Let's go into our two substantives. Number one, how this increases tensions, how war will grow under proposition. The first layer is that the first premise of the layer is that we told you Putin is doing this for popularity. The same thing with Crimea, same thing with all Russia's historical violences. What does an attempted assassination do then? Two things. One, it gives Putin justification to do more attacks. Understand, we told you the media in Russia have already victimized Putin. They already call this a special military operation. They're not calling it an unprovoked attack. Because Putin already looks like a victim, what happens when there's an attempted assassination? On the best case, there's a victimization of Putin. He will use this to further A, patriotism, and B, gain support, resources, and money from his wide range of oligarchs, which have supported his entire regime. What's the impact of this? More attacks with more money, more weapons. What is the worst case then on prop side of the house? There's a Russia-China military alliance. Why is this likely? We already see Russia and China already aligning when it comes to combining their banking system in the status quo. Russia and China also have been long have been allies. We think Putin will move on apart from Ukraine to attack on other countries within the perimeter when China and other powerful countries in the East is involved. Then let's look at the second impact. There's angst and anger towards the West. This is where countries in the East, such as Russia's powerful allies, are likely to band together against the West. We think that this is a lack of there's a lack of cohesion within the global stage. Then things like sanctions and other ways that we're trying to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine are not going to happen because companies are not likely to comply. What is the second layer then? We think assassination is not likely. We already told you NATO is not going to allow it. NATO is just an organization. The member states are not likely to buy into this, and Putin is definitely ready to protect himself against the war. Our second substantive then, why sanctions are more effective. We have to look at what's happening in Russia now. Big energy companies, BP, Exxon, Shell, they've already announced departures away from their biggest partner, which is Russia. This proves to you that a lot of companies, no matter how big their stake is in the country, are already pulling out of Russia. We think this causes civilians to complain. We think this is pressure towards Putin to de-escalate the situation. Under the status quo, sanctions already work. Secondly, we think Putin cannot do much in defense. But in the past few months, Putin knew that sanctions were coming. I'll answer that later. He tried to make sanction-proof networks and firewalls, but they have not worked. Why? It's very difficult to connect oneself from the global economy and protect yourselves away from sanctions. It's very difficult on those grounds. So we think sanctions will be effective because of that. Why then are sanctions effective? There's a spiral effect. The more the businesses pull out, the less economic sense it is for others to remain. Other companies start pulling out. Why? Second reason why companies are likely to pull out, because companies are not likely to earn any money in the Russian market. There will be the number of people who can afford the company's products and requires it will now shrink. And two, the cost of doing business in this offending country such as Russia rises, and it's also hard to find goods and services that will keep the company's business running. And lastly, even if the company, which is still in Russia, that have not sanctioned Russia, still earn money within Russia, they don't have any ability to bring that money back to the US financial systems or their other national financial systems. Let's look at the weighing then. We think prop is going to kill Putin. They never told you how that's morally justified. They never told you how it's going to de-escalate the situation. On a comparative, we told you sanctions will be effective because it de-escalates the situation. It's very possible and it's working under the status quo. Because of that, so proud to oppose.
Thank you, LO. Now let's have the DPM.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, can I just get a second? I just need to do something. Give me a second. Yeah, I'm back, sorry. Oh, wait, I'll just start my timer. I'll be going 3, 2, 1. When an all-powerful dictator has been in power and is currently known in status quo for reducing entire countries to rubble, the moment when you don't remove this person from a position of power, that is the moment when you're on the morally unethical side of this debate. They talk about us not having ethics, but I'll prove why it's morally justified to kill Putin. So a few rebuttals. They talk about how sanctions will be effective. So they talk about how they'll implement much higher and heavier sanctions, and they'll make the Russian economy suffer. This exact short-sightedness resulted in a slap towards the West when they thought Russia wasn't prepared for this, because taking status quo, Russia legalized piracy. For example, this is one of the multiple reasons and multiple ways he did it. He legalized piracy to combat sanctions, and in return made the West bleed of billions of dollars, because their entire revenue stream from media and other things were basically like bleeding, and basically Putin reversed the effects of what the sanctions were originally meant for. We need to understand that Russia is smart this way. Putin might be irrational in this sense, but he's actually prepared for this, and we genuinely think that they've got multiple ways of doing this. Finally, Russia also stockpiled $600 billion. Do you know how much that money is? It's actually also being effectively used to maintain the ruble, which is Russia's currency. And taking their best case, even if sanctions did not work and are not effective, we can see the only time that they were actually effective, it didn't stop Putin from invading Belarus when he was irrational, and he still made that call. So we think that even if the country is going to bleed economically, the entire reason why Putin is not going to stop is because he's not behaving rationally. Moreover, on a general comparison, Russia is much more prepared for sanctions. That's why we think that this entire point doesn't stand. Their counterfactual was useless in this debate. They say they'll use this assassination attempt as a justification for this. See, I really don't see the point of of this being an argument, because regardless of what justification or like basically what you're gonna put, Putin is gonna invade, and nothing will change the fact that nothing is gonna change from the past except when you remove him from power by assassinating him. We think that this entire justification point was not needing, because we're talking about the pragmatic outcomes in this debate, not the entire reason for this happening on their side. So they talk about how assassinations will fail. They pretty much are wasting their time because Devesh was so charitable. He told you, even on our worst case, we're able to accomplish this. And he gave you multiple ways of doing this, about how we'll internally assassinate him, or there'll be external factors in which they'll like assassinate him, and other ways. They talk about how, basically like Russia is basically going to be coerced into finally stopping and invading Ukraine once like sanctions take effect. But we need to understand the entire reason for Russia doing this in the first place and not doing it before was because they were preparing for this. We're taking their own framing. Putin has been in bunkers for like months on end. That clearly shows that they were prepared for this. That is their own framing, and that's why we can prove that Russia is likely to be prepared for multiple worse scenarios, and that's why they're going to continue to do this regardless of what is happening. So now I'll be like this argument is basically going to also be responding and clashing with how is it morally justified to kill Putin. So argument about how we're obligated to defend Ukraine due to their charitable past, and this method of taking out the entity, which is also known as Putin, is the best thing we can do for them. So why is this true? Ukraine, after splitting from the USSR, was a very charitable state. They used Western ideologies and participated in shifting state narratives, which were originally like communism and other things, out of compassion to what the West and EU thought were fit for this. They were a very charitable state. They did trade deals with multiple states and actively contributed a lot to the EU's and NATO's like relations and economy. Moreover, it was also charitable when it cooperated with EU states by letting them have mutual beneficial deals in which that they were not being like their original mother state, which was Russia, in which they are actively like giving heat towards EU for multiple reasons. Finally, even though they passed up an opportunity to they were even passed up an opportunity to join NATO, but they shelved it to the altruistic sense in which they did not want to increase conflict with Russia and the other states. We think they were altruistic, and that's why we're justified to defend them. So why is it bad that we don't like? Why is it good that we don't let Ukraine take it over? And why does their side actively like? Why should our side actively defend this? First of all, if we let Ukraine get annexed, it creates a mindset for the power-hungry Russian state in which they think there's no opposition for invading these states. This creates like a perpetual loop of them going and invading other countries and thinking that they're not going to face ramifications. But there are two major impacts, and I'll just be talking about them. So Russia will be stuck in this constant loop of invading states again and again without facing active backlash for this. This is horrible because the greed and garnering of resources from annexing states will result in Russia getting stronger and stronger and more arrogant, which was more likely to them going to war with significantly stronger countries that are members of the EU. This means now that they're getting ballsy enough to actually do this because they have been like literally have no opposition from other states. They literally have been doing this in a perpetual loop. Belarus happened, Ukraine happened, it's already going to happen, and it's going to continue a loop if we don't stop this. Their side causes the entire region around Russia to be war-torn because they did not step in the first place and end the factor which causes this increased conflict in the first place. So secondly, post-annexation, what will happen to these countries is morally and principally disgusting because literally there will be no regard for human life or civil liberties, and you think that NATO is basically the safeguard and promoter of these human rights, right? And regard for human life. They think they're the settlers who made this entire mindset out of for respect of human life and rights. This is literally the Western ideology. So for maintaining integrity, NATO first of all has the incentive to do so, like defend and assassinate Vladimir Putin, so he doesn't like continue this in a like control loop or whatever. And they're also principally justified to do it in the first place because they're the safeguarders of this ideology. And I think it's principally just that they adhere to the concepts that they state. So let's do a world comparison here, and let me just like talk about what just let me give a few extensions. They talk about how China and the East will band together. We think this is also assertive because two reasons why China is already facing the heightened tensions with Hong Kong and Taiwan, and secondly, they've already called out for an end to the war and condemning Russia. And another layer to this, we think that O is going to claim that China is going to basically like keep on doing this, but this is quite irrational. We already talked about how sanctions are not going to be perfect for this, and how about how like if like we like improve, like they're going to improve economical sanctions on Ukraine, on Russia, and we already show this is not going to be effective. So let's do a small world comparison here. But before that, any POIs? No POIs. So let's move on to world comparison here. On our side, we're able to effectively contain the threat of the situation in which now Russia is not going to be hell-bent on annexing into other states in a perpetual cycle. Moreover, we think that on our side, we're able to prevent atrocities from being committed in the future because the new leader is likely to be cooperative with us, regardless of a best case and worst case scenario. Devesh talked about this. We're able to have and maintain Russia-NATO relations, and as a result of the assassination of Vladimir Putin, the geographical location finally is like around Russia is finally rid of conflict and abuse to other states, finally NATO appears strong and they stick to the narrative. Panel, we win this debate because we're able to overthrow the person who's solely causing many states to suffer and reducing the entire countries to rubble. Side with us because we're not the side which is responsible for the death of the Ukrainian individuals.
Thank you, DPM Nalsa VDLO.
Am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, so I'm gonna get my timer. I will start my speech in 3. Oh, sorry, PY, just unmute yourself. I think I'll take 25 minutes time. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We agree with all the bad things about Russia and like all these things given by OG about how there's human liberty, Russia's bad, all these things. These things are intuitive. Yeah, the war is bad. NATO is supposed to protect. Yeah, okay, we agree with all these things. But then OG loses the moment they characterize the aftermath of this assassination and they give a very, very one-dimensional layer. What do you think exactly will happen when the Russian people see their exact leader killed by the West? That it leads to instability, a fight for power by the oligarchs, which they themselves have been mentioned. It leads to even more instability, which they see is directly caused and linked to by the West. It creates even more hostility. No one will accept NATO. You cut off one head, millions will pop up, rising and be even more hostile against you. This debate should be about that and how to solve that. That's something OG critically misunderstands. I think this is something very clear. 2 issues then in this debate. Firstly, why is it not aligned with NATO, and like why is this assassination, even when it happens, I'll explain it's still bad and it creates tension. But secondly, how do we solve this war even with sanctions and why it's ineffective under their side? Before then, 3 points of framing. Firstly, if you leave the status quo to itself, throw out the entire extreme idea they bring of a third world war. Putin is only furthering this idea of past glory. Ukraine is an ex-USSR country. That's why he wants to do it. There's no reason for Poland and all these countries. The same way there was big worry over Crimea, but it was this Crimea being taken over. It's a ludicrous idea even to bring up nuclear war because it's a mutually destructive thing. These are just false threats. Like OG completely having this jumpy claim that will somehow lead to the end of the world. Secondly, I want everyone to throw out OG's characterization of the Russian economy. Do you think when the ruble is the lowest it's been in 100 years, that Russia is somehow prepared for this? That somehow there's this genius that will accept, that will explain this. Putin himself is not even trusting this. The army is unprepared exactly because he didn't stop invading Crimea. There was pushback against him. There was bigger justification for him to spend more of the country's economy to war and to win. That's what happens under their case. And thirdly, I think the info of this assassination will be leaked. I think it's just understood, like I said, like it's a smooth thing. Russia spy, intel, all these things, it's easy to just blow this up to the public. Now then, moving on to my main substantive. Firstly, how do we solve this issue? Like what's happening under their side? You have to characterize Putin's strategy for popularity. I want you to recognize that before the war and even now, Putin's popularity has been going down and down. It's because of inefficient policies, these things that the Russian people hate. He's losing popularity now. You think that people are okay with this? Like even before the Ukrainian conflict, this has been his strategy for years. He loses popularity, he invades Chechnya, he invades Crimea. There was a pushback against the Russian people. The Russian people has a justified incentive to push for Putin because he thinks he's the savior. That's what happens when you push back against Putin. It leads to more soldiers. When Putin glorifies dying for your country as my soldiers, when there's a pushback against them, that's exactly what happens when a big force like NATO directly assassinates or even tries to assassinate him. The comparative for our side, if complete Ukraine annexation is literally impossible. Like there is fight back, there's sanctions, there's military support coming from NATO without this big jump of army or assassination. That's a big difference. I think that's something I want to make very clear. And secondly, is that how to talk about like Russia is prepared from reversing sanctions and piracy. That doesn't happen because one, internet piracy doesn't happen. Like it's as easy as banning that in Russian area. These things already happen. Secondly, if you're talking about like they're keeping McDonald's and these businesses up, it's not that easy like to run in a whole thing. I think like they're still losing. Like eventually the supply chain, all these things will somehow stop. Russia cannot just handle these all themselves. I think that's just something ridiculous. But then lastly, my unique extension, how will sanctions properly solve this? Like what are they ruining the moment you try to just go to this complete jump that sanctions are already solving? First of all, it removes Putin's popularity amongst his core supporters, not just the people, but his elites. This looks like people underground, losing their money to buy food, bread being worse and worse money. They can't afford food. There's more incentive for them to fight up when their literal whole lives are being turned up by Putin. International and even like international brands taking off, but then even the elites, mind you, their assets are being taken over. Their companies' wealth being disrupted through Western invention. They lose swift banking systems, their wealth and income directly. Because recognize these elites have trusted Putin to keep up their lavish lifestyles. The moment when the general public of Russia is against them, like that's why they wanted Putin to make sure that people like oligarchs and keep their lavish lifestyle. But the moment Putin fails to do this through these sanctions, will further increase for them to actually make Putin stop and this conflict stop. People don't want to put up with this, right? But then exactly the comparative, when the moment you assassinate him, like even like the success or not, there's a just cause for further war because it creates the mindset and narrative that the West is actively hostile towards the Russian people. Not just these people, even the elites will have a reason to actually try to fight back, to use their income to get more warnings, like not stop their lavish lifestyles. I think the impact is like when you create this bigger, like big pushback for the Russian people, the NATO military will not be able to handle this. Their only support is literally the US military, and they're busy fighting millions of other wars. These things happen. They have to push their military all the way from North America today. They cannot handle that. So then under our side is I want to be clear, even if it's slowly, and like even if it's slowly, like we can solve the issue. But then I want to directly engage any points in closing. If they want to bring about there's a refugee problem, I think refugee problems will not exist the same way like people from Middle East going to Europe happening, because because it's similar ancestors, similar cultures, same people, like people going to Poland, they're being accepted. These things doesn't happen. So that's what we've proven on their case. But then let's see second issue is why what's being going on assassination, and like why is it you're failing your duty as NATO when you do this assassination? So they say that you will buy over Russian agents somehow and get them to assassinate. That's their feasibility. I think firstly, Putin only keeps his closest associates, even the large, like he has his large table keeping Putin away from like his major people. He has this big, like even the bunker, when you saw like him on the video being photoshopped, he's in his bunkers, he's hiding himself from the assassination. It's very hard to do this. Secondly, you can't bribe people. The moment the punishment of betraying Putin is literally killing you and your entire family for betrayal. I think no one will accept that for money, even the medium agents who are paid well enough by Putin. And thirdly, Putin will know ahead of time. Like he's already hiding. There's Russian spies happening. Like these things are unstoppable. I think it's very hard for NATO to do these things, especially when NATO is not suited for assassination. Like they're supposed to be the peacekeeping and those things. Like they don't have the capacity to do this. But lastly, talk about how like they will somehow de-escalate tension by having oligarchs and these things the moment the aftermath of the assassination happens. I think firstly, the idea of oligarch takeover is as unlikely. The moment like there's multiple oligarchs happening, they're all going to fight for conflict and they're going to fight for power. But then recognize that the people themselves hate the oligarch, because Putin has been the intermediary for both, making sure that the people and oligarchs are fine. Exactly. Then Putin's successor, which I look like some low-level guy, is more likely to rise up and stop the conflict and become the new leader. But secondly, I think why is this so bad? Exactly because I think the idea of them just completely dismiss is society will just be fine with this is ludicrous. Even if they leak, like even if like there's a slight information leak, Putin like it'll just easier to just completely justify society, like they don't care, like everyone's against us. I think that these things happen. I think like thirdly, even if they can do all these like to stop popularity, like to get leak information, these things, the people will not care. I think the idea of this aggression leads to citizens who are terrified and needs to fight back against the West, exactly because they literally killed their own leader. This leads to massive harms to the country, which leads to people being more aggressive towards the West. It leads to like instability because there's no leader fighting for power, and all the while more conflict in other countries are still happening, and like even bigger military output, for example. But then lastly, even if the assassination is successful on our side, it will only increase more chaos and hostility of Russia against the world. What you characterize as like an extreme of a leader being assassinated by a foreign power. Putin has a second in command and a successor. These are all prepared. He's accepted. But then what leads to is extremist views in the country. As to say that like people will say, oh, if you support the West, you're supporting the people who killed our leader, you're supporting the people who put us into economic turmoil. These things happen, and then what happens then is the current protest against Putin to accept the West is much harder to justify the moment you justify them like, oh, you're supporting the people who hate us, and these things happen. I think that even if the impact isn't now, for the potential future impact is potentially much more harmful. The same way Germany retaliated the moment the Versailles agreement happened. I think the impact is you fail your duty as NATO. You're not an assassination force. I think their supporters are rational people. They want to like help them and support them. And they, for example, like people dislike like CIA interventions even, and like it leads to further deaths of your own people in the military. It's not worth it. Like for example, it's not worth it because like it increases pressure of your close allies in Poland, like who cannot stop this attack the moment Putin and like the Russia country as a whole wants to further their aggression. And the risk of NATO failure is so bad when you abandon this is further increased danger. We solve this obligation the best way when you don't increase danger and you don't create justification for Russia to fight back harder. Yeah.
Thank you, Deputy LO. And I think both CG and CO haven't given their consent to be recorded. So I'd be asking also the recording to be stopped at this